Today's news will be about John Lewis and what he did. John Lewis was born on February 21st, 1940, outside of Troy, Alabama. John Lewis was born into an era of racial segregation. Inspired by Martin Luther King Jr., he also joined the Civil Rights Movement. Lewis was a freedom rider who spoke at 1963's March on Washington, and he was also the youngest speaker there. So, what next? Lewis then led the demonstration known as Bloody Sunday, or the Selma to Montgomery March, where Lewis was severely beaten. And this time, he suffered a fractured skull. Lewis was also involved in other demonstrations like the nonviolent sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. He even got arrested at these demonstrations, which upsetted his mother. But he was committed to the civil rights movement. Lewis was inspired by Martin's sermons and news on the 1955 through 56 Montgomery bus boycotts. He acted for the changes he wanted to see. So now moving on to the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1963, Lewis became chairman of the SNCC, and in the same year, he became known as one of the Big Six leaders of the Civil Rights Movement. He helped plan the March on Washington, but even when the Civil Rights Movement Act became a law, it did not make it much easier for African Americans to vote in the South. So to bring attention to this struggle, Lewis and Hosea Williams led a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama on March 7, 1965. After crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the marchers were attacked by state troopers. The day known as Bloody Sunday sped up the passage of the 1965's Voting Rights Act. And now on to John Lewis as a U.S. Congressman. Lewis had left the SNCC in 1966, even though he was devastated by the assassinations of King and JFK in 1968. He had continued his work to enfranchise minorities. Then in 1970, he became director of the Voter Education Project. During his tenure, the VEP helped to register millions of minority voters. Lewis then ran for office in 1981, winning a seat on the Atlanta City Council. In 1986, he was then elected to the House of Representatives. Representing Georgia's 5th District, he was also one of the most respected members of Congress. Since entering office, he was called for health care reform, measures to fight poverty, and improvements in education. But most importantly, he oversaw multiple renewals of the Voting Rights Act. This is my Works Cited page, and this will end my slide.